mysterious processes that goes on all the time around us. And the Hebrew word for it is tzmicha. The English word is springing into life, growth. What happens when you have what looks like a closed situation, and then you begin to be aware that imperceptibly something is stirring inside, and something gradually comes to light. My subject officially is the well-discussed, often discussed question of Exodus. When we say that we left Egypt, right, the expression is Yetziat Mitzrayim. We went out of Egypt. The Exodus from Egypt. It's very easy to say the words glibly. I want to emphasize, by way of getting into my subject, I want to emphasize a Kabbalistic, Hasidic meaning of the word Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim not so much referring to a well-known country in the ancient Near East, but referring to a state of being, Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim. That is that the Mitzrayim, the Egypt that they left, was not necessarily only that country, but a state of the soul. Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim, Mitzar is a tight place, straight, S-T-R-A-I-T, a straightened place. A place, you could say, of angst, a place of anguish. These words, the German word angst, the English word anguish, the French word angoisse, all of them come from the root that means straight. Ang means straight, a straight place, a narrow place. The Hebrew word is tsar, narrowness, metzar. And there has been this tradition, it's a tradition that has, at certain moments of history, become very important. To think of Yetziat Mitzrayim not as a specific geographical, historical moment only, but as I've said already, a state of the soul. One can have Mitzrayim, says the Sfat Emet, one of the great Hasidic commentaries on the Torah, 19th century. He says, Yesh Mitzrayim b'chol zman u'v'chol makom. There is Mitzrayim, there are straits at every time and every place. It's a condition, I'll say for the third time, it's a condition of the soul. It's an experience in which one feels one cannot move. One is pinned in place by factors, by situations, and the more one struggles to get out of a place like that, sometimes the tighter the pincer grip holds. So struggling is no good. How does one ever then get out of a place that holds one firmly and tightly arrested? That's the question behind, it's an impossible question behind my discussion this evening. We say so blithely, they left Egypt, the Exodus, right? One minute they were in, the next minute they were out. It turns out that if one thinks in a particular kind of way, which I'd like to do this evening, the question is not at all blithe, it's a really vexed question. How does one indeed get out? How does one emerge from a place in which one is submerged? One is inside and one is held inside. How does one ever get out? Now, anyone who's ever been in such a situation already is well ahead in our discussion. And it seems to me that if we start thinking, we all know something like a situation like that. That somehow, by definition, seems inescapable when you're in it. And then the question is, how is it possible then ever to emerge from it? And people do emerge from inescapable places. The process by which that becomes possible, I want to say, is hinted at in that Hebrew word, smicha. The idea somewhere of something growing from within the most sterile, closed places, starting off imperceptibly, and then growing to fuller and fuller power. How does it work in our original story? We look back now at this story. The Mitzrayim, the straits that we're talking about here. This is a world, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, this is a world, for instance, in which there is only one voice that speaks. That's already bad news. That there is one voice that speaks and lays down the law. That is Pharaoh's voice. Pharaoh is the only speaker at the beginning of this story. He is the one who says how it shall be, how things are going to be. The word that the rabbis use for this genre of speech, which is Pharaoh's way of speaking, the rabbis call it a gzera. The gzera, an edict, right? A harsh edict. He was always issuing harsh edicts. Gzerot kashot. That's what the rabbis say about Pharaoh. And suddenly this becomes almost a metaphysical statement, that we understand that's Pharaoh's whole way of being, to speak unopposed. He's an absolute monarch, so he speaks unopposed and no one can discuss any matters with him. Once there has been a gezerah, metaphysically speaking, once there has been an edict, ein lashiv. There is no possible repeal of the edict. You may recognize that expression from the book of Esther, where Achashverosh decrees things, and then we're told at a certain point that once he has decreed things, there is no possible rollback of the decree. So you have to think of other ways if you want to cancel the decree. The nature of a decree of this kind is that there's no other voices allowed. And that's the only voice that we hear at the beginning of this book. It already sets the tone. Now, I can't help comparing this with the beginning of the book of Genesis, which is the only book we have it to compare it with. When we get up to Exodus, we can only look back at what we've just had. The beginning of the book of Genesis, if you want to be mischievous, you might say it also begins with only one voice speaking. Yeah, you remember the beginning of the book of Genesis? Who speaks at the beginning? God. So, all right, you might say God is allowed. God is allowed to be that one voice that speaks and no one answers him, you might say. And Pharaoh is doing a very poor imitation of God here. You might say it's a kind of parody of God. However, I would like to mention that in the Midrashic tradition, in the rabbinic tradition, God is not allowed to speak alone. As you may know, God says certain things, and the angels argue with him. God says, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. And you might think that the omnipotent God could have it all his own way. No, the angels also have a view on the subject. They think it's a very bad idea to create man, for instance. And there's a whole discussion that follows. Now, this is a kind of whimsical note, but I think it already sets a very different tone. When God speaks, there is discussion. When God speaks, however much of an absolute his word is, somewhere there's always a sense of a possible field of discourse. That this, it would be possible to say this, it would be possible to say that, and the discourse is not repressed. When we come to Pharaoh, no one has anything to say. The first people who really have anything to say in response to Pharaoh are the midwives, who act rather than speaking. They both act and speak in contradiction of Pharaoh's decree. But it takes a long time till we get there. Meantime, Israel, for instance, the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, are entirely silent. No one has a word to say in protest as Pharaoh issues his decrees, his absolute decrees. We're inside an inescapable situation. One other thing we're told about Pharaoh, which I think is indicative of such systems of government, on the one hand, but really taking it much more broadly, such metaphysical realities. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the first thing we're told about Pharaoh in the book of Exodus is Asher lo yada et Yosef. The one characterization that's given of him is that he didn't know Joseph. That means, presumably, that he didn't remember. Well, it's not so long after all. He could have read a history book or something like that. He might even have it passed. Surely he must have heard of Joseph, who saved his whole people from famine not so long ago. But the first word that's used about Pharaoh is in the negative, lo yada. He was a not knower. He was someone who refused to know. What does to know actually mean? The classic understanding of the word to know. Adam knew his wife, Eve, if you remember. Vayayeda Adam et Chava ishto. What is to know? To know is a very intimate relational thing. It means that you are not alone in the world, that you have a connection with something outside yourself. Pharaoh is someone who doesn't know Joseph, the man to whom his nation owes so much. And there's a discussion among the rabbis about this. One of the rabbis says, yes, it means exactly what it says. He just was ignorant of history. But the other rabbi says, and it's a very pointed, modern comment, Asa atzmo ki'ilu lo yada. He made himself as if he didn't know. Now that's already sophisticated. That means that Pharaoh is the kind of person who constructs himself as having no needs from anyone else in the world, no need for gratitude, no historical memory, and in fact, not knowing Joseph becomes his program for genocide. What comes out of that lack of essential links with one's own history and with those with whom one should be connected, what comes out of that in the end is license to kill, license to destroy a whole nation. Now that is something very, very profound about Pharaoh, that he doesn't know. In the end, when Moses comes to him and asks him, claims, demands, let my people go, shalachat ami, you remember Pharaoh's answer? He says in the first person this time, lo yadati et Hashem. I don't know God. And it's clear that he doesn't just mean I've never heard of him. What he means really is I don't know that which God stands for. I don't know what the divine is. What is this particular form of authority that you're bringing to bear on me? I've never heard of it. It doesn't speak to me. I have no idea about it. So there's something obtuse about Pharaoh, something in all his arrogance that is bound up in himself. And that creates a system that is then unbreakable. Qualities, characteristics of Pharaoh, unfortunate negative characteristics of Pharaoh affect the Israelites as well. Once you are in a kingdom like that, then you somewhere begin to pick up some of those habits. Out of sheer suffering, perhaps, out of traumatic experience. One of the things that the rabbis say about the Bnei Israel, about the Israelites in Egypt, is that they found it difficult to be aware, to be fully aware of their own pain. Now that's a statement, that they were in great pain, suffering on all kinds of levels through the persecution and the genocidal plans of Egypt. And somehow they managed not to suffer as much as you might have thought. The idea is mooted when God says to Moses, eventually, at the burning bush, in his first meeting with Moses, when he tries to commission him to go on the redemptive mission, God says, Ki yadati et machovav. I have seen their sufferings and I know their pain. Yadati et machovav. I know their pain. That is, I have an intimate sense of something that a God really can't have an experience. Gods don't know pain. Right? Gods are above pain. And yet this God says, I know their pain, and the Midrash adds, which they don't fully know themselves. And gives a rather macabre analogy, a parable. It says, it's like dead flesh, basar met, that doesn't feel the scalpel, doesn't feel the pain of the knife because it's desensitized in some way. It's incapable of knowing. That is, through suffering, the Israelites have reached a stage in which, we've said already, they're absolutely silent. They have nothing to say. There's no protest against the situation that they're in. And the first cry that comes out of them, we have to wait for 2 chapters. The end of the 2nd chapter, there is a sudden explosion of cries and screams and shouts and wails. I'm just at random 4 synonyms in English. To translate 4 synonyms in Hebrew. Right? The Hebrew language goes crazy at this point, and suddenly we get 4 synonyms for the word to cry. Non-verbal crying out. As if that's a kind of rudimentary first movement towards life. That they have been inert up to now, and the first sign of life is when they suddenly begin to cry. If you'll remember, it's at the moment when the old Pharaoh has died. And so the Israelites have a plausible reason for crying. That is, the excuse for their crying is that they are mourning for the old Pharaoh, quote unquote. That gives them license, and suddenly a cry bursts out of them. And that cry that bursts out of them is the first expression of life, of sentience. Nolad lahem tza'aka, says one of the Hasidic commentaries. I want to be thinking somewhat about his general idea. The Beit Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Leiner, the son of the Ishbitzer, if that means anything to you, late 19th century, radical Hasidic thinker, who says a cry was born in them. Suddenly, from out of the depths of their being, a cry emerged. Up to that point, no language, no reaction. And at that point, when they begin to cry, then God hears their cry, and God sees their pain, and God sees, hears, remembers their fate, and finally God knew. God vayeda Elohim, with great emphasis on that kind of knowledge, on a kind of intimate knowledge, a kind of communication with someone who is not him. That is the beginning. Things begin to stir here. This is the beginning of a movement in which perhaps great things can happen. This notion that meantime God is holding the pain of the people, holding it somewhere in storage, till they can come to feel it themselves, till they're capable of beginning to feel their own pain. Now, the assumption behind everything I've been saying is that if you have a situation in which human beings are alienated from themselves, are alienated, the word for it is exile, yes. They are exiled from them, they are begalut, they are in exile. That doesn't just mean being in a foreign country. It means in some way that one has basically lost contact with everything that gives one an identity, gives one a clear sense of who one is. How does one ever move from a situation like that? I repeat the impossible question. From a situation like that to a situation where one has a sense of one's own identity. One is capable of leaving, Yetziah. After all, if it's called leaving Egypt, Exodus, it means to some extent walking out on your own feet. It doesn't mean being dragged out of Egypt. When it says that God brought them out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, we prefer to read it, right? It's a question what it means. It could mean that they were so inert by that time, the Israelites were so inert that God had to really physically move them out of Egypt. But we prefer to read it, and we understand that it's a much better reading, to understand that people have to get to a point in which there is that in them which wants to be free, which wants to find a different identity, a real identity, rather than the satellite identity of being part of an impossible system. Now, that means that a process has to get underway within the Israelites if there is to be Exodus. How is that process then described? How does it come to happen? I want to just gesture at the first long source on your page. Number 1, do you have the source pages?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry it's not translated. I just want to point out one or two things that are important here, I think. At a certain moment, it's at the end of Parshat Shmot, after Moses has gone to beg for the people's liberty, Shalachet Ani, and after Pharaoh has come down even harder on the people. That is, Moses has made his claim, and Pharaoh has responded by increasing the burden of slavery. Now that seems like a really perverse mission that Moses has been on now. He turns around to God and he says to God, why have you done evil to your people? You've sent me on this mission of deliverance, and all I've done is make things worse. And God answers, now you're going to see how things begin to move. Ata tireh. Ata with an ayin. Our Hasidic commentary, Rabbi Yaakov Leiner, end of the 19th century, reads that word now, meaning really now. Why now? Because now they're crying. Now they have begun to scream and howl and shout. They hear their own voices. They hear something coming from the depths of them. Now that they hear that, that will get things going. Now things can begin to happen. Hatza'aka atzma she'ata tzo'ek yitzmach lahem hayeshua. The cry of the people, and your cry, Moses, when you cry out in protest to me, God says, these are signs of life and health. That protest now will be the beginning of Yitzmach HaYeshua, Tzmichat HaYeshua, the springing forth, the growth. It's really an untranslatable word, tzemach. It's actually a word. Tzemach is, of course, the ordinary Hebrew word for a vegetable, yeah, of certain kinds. But it's also the word, at the other end of the spectrum, it's also the word for the Mashiach, for the Messiah. Classic name for the Mashiach would be Tzemach Tzaddik. Tzemach Tzaddik. Tzemach means the offshoot, someone who has shot forth from a deep source. What is the meaning of the word Litzmoach? Now salvation can begin to spring forth, says our Hasidic writer. What does it mean to spring forth? To spring up, to spring forth. I imagine those potatoes that one put into jars as children, yes, or avocado cores, and then day by day, surrounded by a moist environment and anxiously visited every morning, you watch those weird expressions of life, those arms and legs that suddenly start emerging from that nothing, as it seems. That as an idea of tzmicha. It's been pointed out that the word Tzadik Mem Chet, the gematria, the numerology of it, is equivalent to the word Menachem. The Messiah who will comfort and console for all the suffering. What is he? What will he be? He'll be something that's tzamach, that in some way has moved from the inside outside, that has moved through a process which we call the process of growth. Now, what would that suggest? What would be needed then? I asked my Pilates teacher what her associations were with the word Litzmoach, because, of course, in the way of Pilates teachers, she was encouraging me by saying, "V'harei at tzomachat," and now you Hebrew speakers can probably get it. Now you just you are very straight. There you are, just rising up into the air, more or less, as if no gravity holds you down. So I asked her what she thinks the word litzmoach means, to grow in that way. And she said, first of all, she thinks it's an association of erectness, of suddenly really a vertical movement, a movement upwards, but also a movement downwards. And that's where these body wisdoms have a great deal to teach us. Litzmoach means you have to put out shoots downwards and shoots upwards. Somewhere you have to get deeper into yourself in order that there should be that energy from which to grow upwards. Now, what do we have here? The Bet Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Leiner, says what you've had up to now is an unconsummated message of redemption. God spoke, and the words seemed to offer hope, and then it seems they backfired. Nothing happened after that. Things got worse after that. Now that's a strange pattern for redemption. And Bet Yaakov wants to say that it's always like this. This is the classic pattern, that God speaks and then his word goes into exile. Interesting expression. Galut hadibur, the exile of the word. God's promise for a moment seems to hold a lot of vitality, and you think, yeah, it's going to happen now. and then it apparently goes limp. Right? It doesn't seem to have any effect. It loses strength. It doesn't seem to have the strength to get translated into reality. And of course, to the consternation of those who were waiting for God's word to become effective in history. And suddenly there's a sense that the enemies of God in the world are having it all their own way. And our Hasidic thinker here makes a suggestion. He says, in order to redeem his word, in order to make his word return in full strength, there is an invitation being issued here to human beings who have just suffered the moment of hope followed by the moment of despair as the hope seems to recede. It's an invitation to human beings to start tzoek. In other words, to begin to discover the roots of their own being and to begin to cry out, to find out what it is they really want, to find out the place of despair in them, and to enter into some kind of deep dialogue with it. And from there begin to discover themselves. Once the human being has begun to cooperate on a deep level with the redemptive process, then God's word will be redeemed. That is, the redemption has to come partly from human hope and human faith, and I don't know what stronger word I can use. It's something to do with human strength. Human strength, if only in the experiencing of pain, if only in the knowledge of one's own pain. The way that Beit Yaakov puts it is like this. He says, have you ever had an experience, we all know such an experience, that you've had, very simple, a good thought. A good thought could mean either a hopeful thought or simply an interesting thought, a thought that's a creative thought. You have the thought, and then it disappears. Ne'evadlo. I love this. It's exactly the way it happens. Have you ever had this happen to you? Suddenly you have an idea, an emotion that seems to go deep, a sense of things, and then suddenly you've lost it. You can't quite find it again. And that's called that God's word has gone into exile. God gave you a good, a thing to think about, something to do with thoughts and words, and then you can't really hold on to it very well. You haven't the stamina to hold on to it. What is all that about, you will say? It's to show you that what you need is to root that thought deeper, ba'omek halev, deep in the heart, to connect it with, he calls it or v'chokhmah, light and wisdom. By or, I think he means heat, actually, heat and wisdom. And when I think of heat, in other words, it has to be connected with warmth, with the heat of the human heart. I want to use the word fantasy. And I want to say that ideas, divine prospects, beautiful ideas, somewhere can come and go like the snows and the first light of the sun. They need to be connected with our real fantasies. And I'm using the word fantasy deliberately, although it's slightly surprising. That is, what is it we really want in our heart of hearts? To connect it with our inner reality, with a place of heat, and then perhaps it can begin to grow. Now, that is, it's an idea that stresses depth of experience, depth of impact, as the way towards redemption. That is, to deepen one's experience, rather than quickness and ease of impact. That, it'll happen and then everything will happen right away, exactly, hashlama, shlemut. That God's word will immediately lead to fulfillment and you'll be able to see everything fulfilled from today to tomorrow. If you don't have that ease of fulfillment, maybe it'll begin to go deeper into you. Somewhere then you begin to grow those roots. Now that is essentially what he has to say, and it's of course important that what he's talking about here most significantly is the idea that you can be in exile, but the worst news would be that God's word is also in exile. That God speaks, makes promises, and it means nothing, apparently. It doesn't seem to mean anything in terms of reality. Look around you, it just looks like all words. That's the condition that he's talking about here. And it's a condition that takes some courage to address, to say there is such a thing, there is such a possibility, and in that case the onus falls. It's as if God's plan then is that one has to take that kind of disappointment and disillusion into oneself and begin to take the measure of one's own desire to be alive and to find redemption. Now, that is all very abstract. I just wanted to quote one more expression that he uses. Mati velo mati. He says, redemption comes, such an abstraction. What is redemption? Redemption comes and it touches without touching. It's a wonderful, delicate expression that goes back to the Zohar. It's not the kind of thing that you can just grasp hold of and say, yeah, it's a thing. Redemption, oh yes, I'm going to go and get some redemption for me. Redemption is a very delicate, impalpable thing. It's a process. It's not a thing at all. It touches without touching. There is something volatile about it. It's here, it's gone. If one wants to give it vitality, then that takes a certain kind of emotional or spiritual work. If one wants to give it force and vitality. Now, this exile of the word, exile of God's word, exile of language among the Israelites, so they haven't the strength to say a word for so long, is reflected in the life of Moses as well. Moses represents the process as it's happening. He doesn't come as someone who has all the solutions. He is a kind of metaphor for what is going on. Moses, as you remember, has a speech problem. This is one of the first things we learn about him when God meets him at the burning bush. And it's the most intimate thing he ever says about himself, I think. He doesn't talk a great deal about himself, about his inner world. But what he does say when God commissions him to go and speak to Pharaoh and to speak to the children of Israel and bring words of salvation, Moses basically refuses the job. He says, I am a bad candidate for this job. Lo ish devarim anochi. I am not a man of words. I am not someone who knows how to speak. Kvad peh u kvad lashon. I'm heavy of tongue and heavy of mouth. It's as if what he's really saying is, he's not describing an impediment as such, although it comes from an impediment, has exactly that idea of a weight in the mouth. The impediment is not the stammer. The stammer is a symptom of the impediment. Moshe feels that there is whatever there is inside him, whatever richness there is inside him, it can't get out into the world. There's something blocking it. There's a heaviness, there's a density, so that he can't actually communicate with the world. He can't come out and speak with others, which is the whole of God's commission. That's what God wants him to do. Eventually, Moses will use the really grotesque image, aral sfatayim, of uncircumcised lips. I've got a foreskin hanging on my lips, kind of something that really blocks any kind of speech. So that Moses, in a way, is a kind of offshoot of Pharaoh's world at first. Who is Moses? If there was ever anyone who has a right to traumatic experience, it's Moses. But experience that goes back before consciousness. Moses is born into a world that wants him dead. Many children alive now were born into a world that wanted them dead in our generation. Yes? So that was that kind of world, a decree against the male children, and that was Moses' situation. His mother has to hide him. His mother hides him for 3 months, and then, because she's afraid to hide him anymore, she apparently obeys the commandment of the king, of Pharaoh, and wraps him up carefully and puts him in a box into the river, just as Pharaoh had said. She seems to be going along, but she's not going along. Because, why does she not go along? Because she has looked at the child. Vatere. She has seen. It was God who suddenly began to see and to hear and to remember and to know. And that reflects the situation of the people who up to now have not been seeing and hearing and remembering and knowing. And now here is one woman who looks at her baby, Vatere et hayeled kitofu. She sees the child, that he is good. Now what that means, does it mean that he's beautiful? Maybe. The Midrash will say that there is light shining around him. There's some kind of he's surrounded by a nimbus of light. Not because he's a saint particularly. I don't know if it really says that he's a tzaddik. It says something unanswerable to her. She has received a communication from the child. Call it Ziv Hashchina, the light of God's presence around the child. And if that's subjective, as far as she's concerned, what mother doesn't see the light of God's presence around her child? That's just fine. It doesn't have to be an objective light. The point is that she can see it, that she's sensitive to it, and that makes her decide to do the best she can do to save this child. If the child is in the end saved, it's because of the gaze, the eyes of three women. Yes? There is his mother, understandably. There is his sister, who watches him from afar when he's put into the river. She keeps her eyes on him, waiting to know what's going to happen, what the next stage of the story, with that sense of process that we've been talking about. This is not the end of the story, that she's waiting, she has a sense of the future, and she has a sense somewhere of there's a particular word I'm trying to get hold of here. Anticipation, yes. Of anticipation of the future. That something is holding her there, waiting to see some part of her nose is organic. Something is organically developing here. And then there are the eyes of the princess, the daughter of the Egyptian king, who also looks at the baby. Right? First of all, she sees the box and has her girls bring the box to her. And then she opens the box. Vatere et, let me read it. Vatiftach, she opens the box. Vatirehu et hayeled, and she saw him, the child. She saw him, the child. It's a double object. Wouldn't it have been sufficient to say she saw the child or she saw him? So the Midrash says, of course, she saw him, the child. She saw, again, the light of God's presence around the child. Vatirehu, sees God. Now, what is she seeing exactly? It doesn't matter. It's not a full-blown vision of God. When you say you see the light of the divine presence, it's an inner state of the depth of the heart. It's a kind of openness towards the future. And she sees the child, and here the child is called the child, all right, V'hinei na'ar bocheh. And suddenly the child seems to grow up very fast as he's still lying in that box, and he becomes a na'ar. And behold, the na'ar was crying. So the baby is crying. But the baby is called a na'ar. And a na'ar is a word that usually is translated the boy, the young man, the adolescent. Yeah? It's an older, a youth, as they used to say, yes? Somewhere in his mid-teens. Why is this word used of a baby suddenly in the box? Most unusual, especially as he's just being called a yeled. Why not stay with that word, a child? And so there is a well-known discussion in the Talmud, which is quoted by Rashi, that says, where one of the rabbis says, he was, in fact, a child, of course, but he had a voice like a young man. That is, he had a precociously developed voice, and the voice with which he was crying was almost frightening in its raw power. Suddenly an uncanny voice comes out of the box. There's an interesting creative suggestion. The other rabbi objects and says, yes, but if you're saying that, then you're saying that Moses had a defect, that he had a weirdness. There's something weird about him. When you have a baby with a voice of a 15-year-old, that's nothing to be wished for. That's not a good thing. It's something weird. We don't want Moses as eccentric. Right? A prophet can't be a balmum, can't have a physical problem. So this would be a problem. Okay, but then I found another midrash that actually makes the the defect, in a way, even greater and even less naturalistic. And says what you have here is a reference in this na'ar, a reference to another verse in the book of Hosea, where God says, Ki na'ar Yisrael. Israel as a whole are a na'ar. The whole people are like a young boy, a boy, va'ohavehu, and I love them, says God. And the implication there is that a na'ar is someone who is full of life, full of energy, but always getting into trouble, doesn't quite know how to use his energies. And so it's a way of reproving Israel lovingly, and saying, God is saying, yes, they are like a na'ar, full of that kind of energy, and you know what? I love them. I love them just as they are. And so the Midrash takes this and says, what you have here is a possible decoding of the biblical verse here. She hears that there is here a boy crying. What is she hearing? And this is her hearing. No one else hears it. She hears the voice of all of Israel crying from that box. And so the na'ar is not a description of this particular baby's state of voice. You know, how deep a voice was it? It's a description symbolically of her sensitivity to the child. That she knows it's one of the Hebrew children. It says it very clearly. If this is one of the Hebrew children, she knows what this child represents and what his fate must be. And therefore, using her, whatever you would call it, her fantasy, her imagination, her imagining of his links, she immediately understands that what is in front of her is the tragedy of a whole people. So her imagination is larger than just the specific case. Now, the specific case is enough to move her. You might say, we don't need all that. A baby crying goes straight to the heart of any woman, you might say. And on that ground alone, it would be sufficient that she would want to save him. But this other dimension is there as well. And somewhere the rabbis want us to understand how even very intimate, ordinary, quote-unquote, relationships, like a relationship between a woman and a crying baby, let's say, any baby, how that can contain within it great density, that it's not as simple as it seems. It can contain within it great power. And so this princess has the kind of spiritual power, I would say, to connect with the implications of this child and takes the child into her. This child then becomes, and this is how we must read it, becomes the child of two mothers. This is a child who's passed now from hand to hand, from his adoptive mother, from his true mother to his adoptive mother, who sends him back with a true mother to get nursed for a few months, and then back to the palace. He stays in the palace. He stays in the palace, and he's named by his Egyptian mother, and he was to her a son. In other words, what's made very clear in the Torah is that child of two mothers, without a clear identity, it's the Egyptian mother who takes him and names him and makes him her son, and the other mother, in fact, disappears from the story. The question then is, does he know who he is when it comes to identity? Is there a Jewish self inside him? Forgive the anachronism. Is there an Israelite identity somewhere there consciously inside him? There comes the day, you remember, Vayigdal, the child grows up, Vayetze elechav, and he goes out to his brothers. Vayar b'sivlotam, and he saw their suffering. Now, here we have a moot point. Does he know, when he goes out to see the slaves, does he know that these are his brothers? It says he went out to his brothers. If he did know, on what grounds did he know? Are we to assume that the princess told him? To me, it doesn't sound very likely that the princess would tell him that actually you belong to a different mother and I'm just the foster mother. Doesn't sound like it when it says Vayhi la leben, that he became a son to her. To me, it's more plausible to think, although I know there are people who think the other way, more plausible to think that he doesn't know about his Israelite background, and he goes out to see what he doesn't know are his brothers. So it's dramatic irony The author knows that they are his brothers, and in a way is communicating with the reader and saying, you and I know that these are actually his brothers. As far as he knows, they're just slaves. And he grows up sufficiently to want to leave the cocoon of the palace and to go out and to look at these poor slaves and to see the truth about them, see what kind of a life do they have. And he went and he saw their sufferings. And then what he sees, of course, is that the Egyptian, who is actually, for Moses, one of his brothers, he must look at him as one of his brothers, is hitting to death, right, is beating to death the Hebrew, who is one of his brothers, the text says. And again, I'd like to say, this is a game of dramatic irony. It's a very poignant game. The author is standing to the side here and saying to us, of course you realize that the Hebrew is his brother, and Moses doesn't know it. All he knows is the scene of violence and the instinctive reaction to choose which is his brother by killing the other. Yes. So he actually ends up by killing the Egyptian, who, as far as he was concerned, was his brother. That is, I'm trying to say, a sense of brotherhood between Moses and the Israelites is not born of an understanding of a common background, but is born of a situation of suffering. He can't bear to see the suffering of the victim, and that's where then he gets his sense of brotherhood. Now, this will develop later. God will make revelations to him later at the burning bush. But he begins then with that sense of an almost absent sense of real brotherhood with his brothers. His brotherhood now is based on a certain feeling that he develops towards them that has to do with suffering and victimage and the gradual sense of identification rather than identity. Let me go straight from here then to the burning bush. Comes to the burning bush, God calls out to him twice, Moshe, Moshe. And he answers in the classic form, he answers, Hineni, here I am. That is total readiness to do whatever God will ask. That's his first reaction to God. But that first reaction is followed very quickly by a very different reaction. And that is, Mi Anochi. Who am I? And I want us to hear these two responses as if they really are in some kind of counterpoint with each other. On the one hand, he's saying, you want me? Here I am. On the other hand, he's immediately saying, this I, who am here, I don't know who that is. I don't yet know enough about myself to know for sure that I am what you want. I don't know. Who am I that I should go to talk to Pharaoh and so forth? But there is this cloud over his essential identity, an internal cloud. He hasn't yet been fully named. He hasn't yet agreed to be fully created, I'd like to say. Something in him has to still move towards identifying totally with the people. That Mi Anochi is really, it's one of the two questions that he will ask of God, which tell us something about the troubled state of an unclear identity with which Moses begins. The other question he asks is, what shall I say to the people if they ask me, what is his name? That God that you said has spoke to you at the burning bush. What is his name? Mashemo. So here are the two basic questions. Who am I? And who is that God who spoke to you? And both, he's asking the question really expecting criticism, expecting antagonism, expecting questions from others, and not knowing really how he's going to answer. And God answers, you remember, in that most beautiful but most evasive way. Moses asked him a clear question. What's his name? What shall I tell them? And the answer is, God doesn't give him a handle, doesn't give him a means of grasping the redemptive power. Instead, he answers, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will become what I will become. I wouldn't translate it, I will be what I will be. And certainly not, I am what I am. I think that's almost the opposite of the meaning of the Hebrew. Ehyeh asher ehyeh is the answer of a God whom you can't grasp hold of. You can't label him. I will become what I will become if you will become what you will become. And it's a relational statement. It's a challenge to Moses, to the Israelites, to become. Litzmoach. To find the wherewithal within themselves to become what they might be, who and what they might be. And so I can only imagine that Moses at this stage is somewhat disappointed by the answer. He doesn't really take in the whole answer at this stage because he wanted a clear answer. He wanted God to tell him, clearly, this is what I'm prepared to do for you. This is the God who does this. A clear identity. Turns out he doesn't have a clear identity. God doesn't have a clear identity. And all the work somehow remains to be done. Something is beginning to stir here, but there is a sense of something not yet consummated, far from consummated, something in process. Perhaps a process of depth, a process of deepening. It still lies ahead. And now I come to the second part of what I wanted to talk about. Where does the good news come from? So far, we've more or less been talking about the rather difficult circumstances in which redemption begins. Right? The first cry, right? The first moment of beginning to intuit something that you don't yet know, that you can't yet really fully know, who you really are. Perhaps before I go on, I just want, as a side comment, to refer to George Eliot's great novel, Daniel Deronda. Anyone read Daniel Deronda? Oh, Baruch Hashem. I believe he's back in fashion now, yes, for good reasons. Daniel Deronda, the story of a Jewish child, son of an ambitious opera singer, Jewish mother from an Orthodox family. The mother wants to pursue her operatic career, isn't happy to have a child, and she gives the child away to a friend of hers who's an English aristocrat to bring up in the lap of luxury, in the purple of the English aristocracy. She couldn't do better for him. And this child, Daniel Deronda, grows up talented and beautiful and admired and loved and curiously blank, not knowing what to do with himself. A kind of skepticism, a sense of arrested animation. These are the words she uses. Suspended animation. What will he do with his life? He can't make up his mind. There's all kinds of possibilities, and everyone expects that he will do the best in whatever he does, and he can't actually attach himself to any idea as if it means something to him. And then there is his meeting with a group of Jews, a fortuitous meeting with a particular Jew, a very learned Jew called Mordecai, who adopts him as his disciple until both of them are wishing and hoping that in some strange way he might turn out to be Jewish, that this aristocrat's son might turn out to be Jewish. And then very powerful things are said. George Eliot understands what I'm speaking about this evening. And she talks about that in-between state of someone who has enormous talents and a certain affinity, let's say, she says, like a painter who's born blind, or a musician, or a musical instrument that has never been played correctly, and a sense somewhere of not yet having met himself, of not having found out what to do with the depths of himself. In the end, he finds out that he is Jewish, and all ends well, at least on that level. He leads the Jewish people to Zion, right? He becomes the potential leader, Zionist leader, to found the Jewish state in what is now Israel. So there is the prophetic George Eliot. There is George Eliot speaking. I bring this up because it seems to me in some way, right, what George Eliot is doing consciously, she's doing on the basis of the Moses story. She refers to the Moses figure as a figure of this kind, without identity and with a yearning for something unknown, something intimate, known and not known, not yet fully revealed. And that's the odd state that we are in now, when we turn now to the third, I talked about three women who looked at Moses, and we turn now to a famous midrash about women who also look. women who use their eyes in a creative way. And this midrash, which I've put in on your page, in number two, because the verse is in number 2. This is, in a way, the point-counterpoint. This is the answer to the questions we've been asking in an enigmatic, midrashic, fabular form. The verse that we're talking about in this midrash, in number 2, appears at the end of the book of Exodus and talks about the laver, the kior, the sink that was made for the Holy Tabernacle. He made the laver of copper and its stand of copper, technical properties. B'mar'ot hatzovot, suddenly not at all technical. It was made out of the mirrors of the women who came in hosts, tzava, asher tzav'u petach ohel moed, who crowded around the entrance of the tabernacle. An enigmatic verse, suddenly referring to the mirrors of crowding women. What women, what mirrors, why does this suddenly turn up? Especially as it's not the only source of copper. There's quite a different source of copper that's given to the tabernacle, copper ornaments and so forth. But this is something very specific, mirrors suddenly. And the midrash that I want to look at with you now, quite briefly, is in number 3. You find, I'll paraphrase and I'll mostly paraphrase, I think. You find that when the Israelites were engaged in harsh labor in Egypt, Pharaoh decreed against them that they shouldn't sleep in their houses, and so they shouldn't have relations with their wives. Well, that's a way of solving your Jewish problem. Just keep men and women separate. And then, of course, nothing can grow. No tzmicha. You keep men and women separate, and there you have it. Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta, one of the great sages, said, "What did the daughters of Israel do?" I always love that question. So the first question that begins his whole story now about what they did is a question. Obviously, they're not going to take this lying down. They're not going to let it just be. They're going to do something about it. So what did they do? And it's all very domestic. They went down to draw water from the river, and God prepared for them little fish in their buckets, and they sold some of the fish, and they cooked the rest of the fish. It's all very domesticated. They sold the fish, and they bought, with the proceeds, they bought wine, and then they went down to the field with a delicious meal, a delicate meal of cooked fish and wine. You notice that this is not doing what comes naturally. This means fishing and selling and buying and cooking. Right? It's the cooked versus the raw. It's a civilized process. It's a process of trying to make something of nothing, of trying to make something of very little. And they go down there to the fields and they give their husbands food and drink. And that's the end of the preamble. And now the midrash proper begins. When they had finished eating and drinking, the women took the mirrors, hamarot, those mirrors that have become famous in Jewish tradition. There are many books written about this. And they look in them with their husbands. Suddenly this domestic scene in the fields of Egypt. She says, "I am more beautiful than you." And he says, "I am more beautiful than you." And in this way, they accustom themselves to desire, and they become fruitful and multiply, and God visits them with pregnancy immediately. That is, they don't have to wait to become pregnant right away. They become pregnant. End of Act 1. Notice that there's a strange beauty competition in front of the mirror, and the woman then leads this strange little game, a kind of boasting game. "I am more beautiful than you," and she answers, "No, I'm more beautiful than you." I'm no great expert in this field, but my reading suggests to me that that's not what you say in a scene like this. What you say is something more gallant, like "You are beautiful, you are gorgeous." But no, she starts off this boasting game. And then now we move into Act 2, and the rabbis then say, so all right, they became pregnant, but how many children were born of that encounter? So the minimum offer is 2 twins. Then there are those who say, no, 6 in every belly. That has its own fame. 6 No, says another of the rabbis, 12 in every belly. And then finally, the final offer is 600,000 in this particular pregnancy. 600,000 babies. By which time we realize that this is not a naturalistic midrash. It's not telling us historical truth. There's something being said here about the power to generate, futures. 1, 2, 6, 60, 600,000. 600,000 would be the whole people. That every woman feels in herself the spiritual and emotional strength to give forth into the world all the varieties of what it takes to make a nation. Each of these estimates gets a proof text to back it up, and then we move on. Then what happens then? The Midrash then comments that all these large numbers of babies all came b'zchut otan hamarot. In the merit of those mirrors, they showed their husbands and accustomed themselves to desire. That's what happened as a result of the work with the mirrors. More than that, then, this scene in front of the mirrors, gave birth to all the hosts that are referred to in that original verse. That's what it means that these women came in hosts. They came in hosts. It's that they produced hosts of offspring. And here now is Act 3. God then says to Moses to make the tabernacle. The whole people offer the precious materials, whatever they have, gold, silver. And the women ask themselves, after all, they have gold and silver, but they ask themselves, what do we really have to give? What's the most precious thing we have to give? And they decide that the best thing they have to give is the copper mirrors, not the gold and the silver. They offer the mirrors, and when Moses sees what they have offered, he is furious. Za'af bahem. He is really furious, and he says to the Israelites, take sticks and break their thighs. Now, this is the moment, it's the most impossible moment. Right? It's a moment in which Moses is against the women with a passion. And he's against the women because there seems to him to be something totally meaningless about their offering mirrors to the holy place. Mirrors are associated with licentiousness, with immorality, with vanity, you name it. Rashi sums up what mirrors are associated with when he, in the previous passage, if you want to glance back at it, he says that mirrors are associated with, he explains to men what a mirror is, what use does a woman make of a mirror. You can see, in case you don't know, gentlemen, the daughters of Israel use mirrors to look in them when they adorn themselves, mitkashtot. Now that word mitkashtot has a sense of suspicion around it. Litkashet, when we say adorn, it sounds all very nice. But what it actually means is to make up for your deficiencies with artifice. Litkashet means to put on makeup, for instance. God forbid, yes? It means actually to try to deceive the world into thinking you are other than you really are. Well, women use mirrors for that purpose, so that in a way is a kind of slur on the mirror, and they offered them, and Moses rejected them because they are made for the evil inclination. We go back to our midrash now. Here is Moses, and I think for good reason, because of his own sense of unsure identity, sense of wanting clarity and truth, to know the clear truth of things. He is particularly outraged by this offer in the place of truth and sanctity, of mirrors that stand for something else. And when he protests, God says to him, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe, Moshe. You just listen to the melody here. God said to Moshe, Moshe, these you reject? These mirrors raised up all the hosts of Israel. Now, raised up means procreated, lahamid. It means, what God is actually saying is that the hosts of Israel came out of these mirrors in some way. They have a procreative power. these mirrors. And that's what the women know about, that women know about this, and you reject this, you are completely wrong. Okay? So it's a complete, God here, if I can say, sponsors the women with their sense of multiform creativity, of a creativity that allows for many possibilities, as against what Moses stands for at this initial stage of his life, which is Moses in his doubt about his identity and his sense of not knowing fully yet who he is and what he is identified with, and therefore in his anxiety, wanting things that are clear and fully identified, not hybrid things, not things that are in any way questionable. Now, that sense of things, where Moses stands on one side and God on the other. God is with the women. Moses, surprisingly, and it hurts a little bit to have to say it, but in terms of the Midrash, Moses is aligned with Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh is the one who is gozer, who wants to keep the men and women apart. And Moses, in some ways, also on the side of Gezerah, on the side of the way things are and the way they have to be, without any sense of possible modulations of how things may work out in a different genre. Now, that's our midrash. What can we do with it? Well, I think I can't do anything better than think about, first of all, about the boasting game. What is she doing to him when she says, I'm more beautiful than you? Right? First of all, it's a game with words. It's a verbal game. She says to him, I'm more beautiful than you. And he answers, if he has anything left in him at all, if there's any will, any desire, any identity left in, that hasn't been totally dispersed in the Mitzrayim, in the straits of Egypt, he answers her, no, I'm more beautiful than you. That is some sense of I am. Beauty perhaps is not quite the right translation for na'eh. It means wholesome, becoming, how else can he put it, harmonious, in some sense, menschlich looking. I'm a mensch. She is saying to him, I am fair, and he says, no, I'm more fair than you. Why did she goad him in this way? Really, it's a goading game. She is trying, unawares almost, to get out of him words of hope and courage. Words of conscious beauty, that I have what to offer, even though he hasn't anything to offer. And that's how a mirror works, strangely. This kind of mirror works exactly like this. I'd like to explain. In objective terms, he is not an object of beauty. Let's assume that. Nachum Sarna, in his book on Exodus, describes, according to archaeological finds, texts that describe the physical state of slaves in Egypt at that time. They were allowed to shower once a year, according to one of these documents. And so they're not exactly very savory, very attractive beings. But the woman here creates a kind of fictional sense, looking in the mirror. There they are looking in the mirror. What kind of mirror is that? This is not the kind of mirror that you look at when you want to find out the dire truth about yourself. Yes? It's not the mirror you peer at to look for small blemishes. That's not the kind of mirror we're talking about. We're talking about a mirror in which all kinds of things become possible. A mirror that allows you to achieve the impossible. The impossible in this case would be to see your own face. That is impossible. That's the kind of basic form of a mirror. A mirror comes to allow you to see what nature will not allow you ever to see. Right? You may come like Narcissus, you may come to a river and get a mirroring of your face in the river. But here is proper mirrors, right? Brass mirrors. You can see what you can't otherwise see. If you have a triple mirror system, my mother had one of those. I used to spend happy minutes in front of this triple mirror system. You can suddenly see the side of your head, the back of your head. Suddenly there's a sense that on a graduated system, it's not abrupt. You shift the mirrors this way, that way, and suddenly you can see all around yourself. A periscope, and you can see around the back of the sofa. It's an amazing thing that happens when you have mirrors playing with each other. More sophisticated systems, telescopes, microscopes, laser systems, and the end is not yet. A sense, therefore, of breaking the bounds of what is naturally possible. That the mirror, what do women do in front of the mirror? They make up in front of the mirror. Yes, they make up. They make up, meaning in some way they invent. They invent, I should say we, I suppose, we invent a self to be today. I'm not asking myself, what is my only true identity? I'm asking myself, who might I be? Some kind of intuition of who I'd like to be today. And then I make up. I role play. Right? I role play. And that is something that men are suspicious of, says, as Rashi gives us to understand, what am I dealing with here exactly? I don't know what's real and what's not real. But for a woman, somewhere there is something very authentic in a strange way. It's a way of expressing a side of myself, of revealing something that's waiting to be revealed. The prophet Isaiah uses a word for mirrors in chapter 3, gilyonim. Gilyonim means revealers. Mirrors are revealers. And Rashi comments there and he says, shemegalot et tzurot hapanim, that mirrors reveal the shapes of the face. How many shapes does a face have? Well, over the course of years, the face changes its shape. Yeah? Or you turn your head and your face changes shape. Now it's that sense of plurality that mirrors are used for. Right? That's one sense of the mirror. What else can we say? The idea then of the terrible decree. Milan Kundera, in his novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being, refers to couples looking in mirrors very often. Couples look in a mirror. In one case, she puts on a bowler hat suddenly, and they both burst out laughing. And she comments to herself, the woman thinks, it's strange how close laughter is to arousal. Something happens at that moment where things are no longer as they always have been and must continue to be. Suddenly there's a new delineation of the couple. The couple looks different because she has shifted something. She has changed part of the decor, and suddenly there is that almost ridiculous sense, it's really a ridiculous sense, of the possibilities of movement, the possibilities of sprouting in one direction or another, without which there can be no redemption, perhaps. And then I also wanted to refer to Oliver Sacks in his book, Awakenings, and I'm thinking about awakenings of all kinds here. There was a film made of this book. Oliver Sacks is the British neurologist who came to work here in New York and wrote his books really on this subject, exactly. How does a soul begin to appear? How does it begin to appear and grow? And he gives one example that has always stayed with me of how he turns up in hospital the first day and he sees victims who are suffering, who have been paralyzed for decades, who are suffering from encephalitis, which they contracted in the great flu epidemic of 1920. And so for decades, these people have been rigid in place. Not a movement. He sees one woman, and obeying some kind of instinct, he throws a ball at her without warning. And before anyone knows what's happened, she's raised her arms and caught the ball and thrown it back, and then returns to her paralysis. That's a kind of foundational story for Oliver Sacks. How suddenly, if you don't lecture the person, if you catch them unawares, then something very other and very true can suddenly begin to be born, like a cry. Suddenly there is a cry of her whole being, and then she goes back. And he has that deep sense in himself of precisely what this moment of awakening could mean in his relation to other patients. And we see it in his case histories of other patients. What do women do in front of the mirror? They coax their husbands. They entice their husbands, something like that, l'shadel. L'shadel is, in modern Hebrew, shdulah is a lobby. Shdulat Nashim is a women's lobby. It's a certain way of using language to change reality. And the Gemara, the Talmud, will use that expression in another interesting context, that mothers know how to lishadel, to coax, to entice their children more than fathers do. And that's why we're told to honor, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out. To honor your father and your mother. That is, to compensate for the natural honor that a child feels for his mother. I got back on track. The statement is, children honor their mothers more than their fathers. That's what it says, naturally. Because a mother knows how to talk a child out of insanity, out of rigidity, out of a tantrum. That she knows how to go along with the child in a way, to become part of his fantasy, and then to grow him out of there, rather than, punishing or other rougher ways of trying to change. That, I think, has everything to do with what we're speaking about here. As Kundera himself says, Beethoven is reputed to have named, to have ingrained in the slow movement of his last quartet the words "muss es sein," a three-note motif, must it be. Must it be? This is Beethoven addressing death. Must death come? And he answers himself, it must come. Perhaps that's why if this is the one gezerah that we have to internalize, that we can't play around, perhaps that's why in houses of mourning we cover mirrors during those 7 days of mourning, as if to say this is a time for a different kind of truth than the truth that is displayed through the use of the mirrors. It's a time for a kind of inwardness. Immediately the 7 days are over, we uncover the mirror and we go on with the flow, with the energy of life. And so, by way of moving to close, working through the fantasy, working through a reality, that's what we have been speaking about here, in order to achieve some kind of breakthrough, some kind of redemption. Have a look at number 6. One more midrash and a piece of the Ishbitzer. Number 6. We read about the midwives. That the midwives feared God. The word fear, to fear God, is used there as a verb, not just as a description of the midwives. It's not that they had Yirat Elokim, but they actively feared God and they kept the babies alive. They didn't let them die. That is the proof text. And here is the midrash. I'm just going to read the first few words. Quite startling. Kashtu atzman lema'aseh ziknan, ze Abraham. They adorned themselves. Kashtu, we saw the word already. They dressed up in the behavior of their grandfather. That's Abraham. What's that all about? So the Midrash explains partially. What it means is that the midwives, faced with this challenge of obeying the decree and being immovable within a world of death, letting death rule, where do they look for help? They look to their grandfather, not strictly grandfather, their ancestor, Abraham, of whom it is written that he feared God. Yes? The truth is that it's written that he feared God in the context of the Akedah, where God says, now I know that you are a God-fearing person. But the Midrash takes a certain license here, as Midrash does, and doesn't stick to the actual context, and says they look at their grandfather Abraham and they see that what he did consistently, somewhere as the continua of his life, what he did was feed strangers, nurture life, make sure that people had nurturance when they came towards him, that he was a nurturer of life, and we should kill life And so suddenly you have the women looking at themselves, I would say, in front of the mirror together with their grandfather Abraham. Conceptually speaking, that what are they doing? They are deploying their imagination, their fantasy, everything that's not strictly factual, and they're looking imaginatively at themselves beside Abraham. And they don't like, or they reject, the possibility that they will be the opposite of Abraham, that they will kill babies. And so they decide, no, we're actually going to keep the babies alive. And they go further than simply not killing. And they opt for life in the kind of strong way that arises when your fantasy is touched, when you begin to know what it is, who your grandfather was, let's say, and you begin to ask yourself, and this is what I like about this midrash, they don't not just saying here, oh, our grandfather was Abraham, we are going to be good people. They dress up as Abraham. Right? They adorn themselves as Abraham. They put on the coverings, the disguises. At first, they're not at all sure that they are Abraham. You know, they're Egyptian women. Either they're literally, well, in this case, they're Israelite women, but they are acculturated Israelite women. But they want to try and find out now, can I be like Abraham? Is it possible to be like Abraham? And they dress up, and what do you know? They find that it suits them. And the idea then is that they become who they are by trying it out. The kind of provisional, improvised situation, a kind of game in a way, but a very serious game. And I think it's interesting to notice that the word lehitkashet, which is to adorn, to put on makeup, everything that's the opposite of truth, can be paralleled with the word kushta, the Aramaic word kushta, which means truth. And so what you have, I think, the concept that you have in some way, whereby once one aligns things in this way, is that what looks like makeup, what looks like trying out identities, improvisational ways of looking at getting at a truth, is actually perhaps and sometimes the best way of getting at a truth. That you don't start knowing exactly what the truth is and what I shall be, but you start in a way by approximating. You start by thinking, is it possible to move, litzmoach? Is it possible to find the roots in myself to grow erect towards that which seems to me now to be just about possible? That in terms of the midwives, and then let's finish with the Mea Shiloach, number 7. This is the Mea Shiloach is the father of the Beit Yaakov, with whom we began, and we can see that father and son have a lot in common. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And God spoke the first words of the first commandment. I am the Lord your God. The Mea Shiloach points out that could have said simply Ani and not Anochi. Now, normally, we treat these two words as synonyms, and there's nothing to be said about it. Ani, Anochi, it's all the same thing. But that's not the way bred on Kabbalah. That's not the way the Mea Shiloach will take it. And he says the difference between Ani and Anochi, you'll have to fasten your seatbelts at this point. The difference between Ani and Anochi is the letter Chaf. Add the letter Chaf to Ani, and you have Anochi. And that already tells the whole story. What is the letter Chaf? What does he have to say about the letter Chaf? The letter Chaf is that which is approximate, imaginative, like, as it were, sort of, and comes up with the daring idea that God does not say in perfect clarity the fully consummated truth of Ani. I am the Lord your God who brought you out. There's nothing more to say about it, that's who I am. Instead, he deliberately chooses to use that more modest, improvised word, Anochi, the word that includes imagination in it, that's open-ended, it sits like that. Right? It's got an open side that has within it what? What is the strength of that weakness? It's a weaker word, clearly. Of course, the best example is the way that in our culture everyone goes around, people below a certain age, go around saying like 3 times in every sentence. Right? That's seriously to be deplored. We don't like that kind of fuzziness. But nevertheless, it is a kind of fuzzy letter. It means I'm introducing fantasy. And God is actually saying here, in this daring teaching, God is actually saying, I am sort of the Lord your God who brought you out of. Gavan is the word he uses. There is a sort of, in other words, approximately. Approximately, you can't know me absolutely and fully for who I really am. There's no point in my giving absolute statements of who I am. This is about as much as you can understand now. This way of being that you now know me as, the place I have in your life now, as you imagine me, that's it for now. But from this light of revelation, this is not the final light of revelation, it's not bahashlamah, it's not ultimate, it's not total, it's not fully consummated. What is the strength of a weak situation like that? Well, just like his son said at the beginning, the strength of it is the possibility of ha'amaka, of deepening. That you are now at the beginning of a process of taking things deeper and deeper into yourself, so that you begin to discover from yourself upwards, right, from the depths of yourself, upwards what the forces of the divine are for you in the world. And as generations go on, the generations will know things from, perhaps, hopefully, from richer and richer sources with which to connect and with which to name God. And that process of ha'amaka, he says, has about it something of light and dark. On the one hand, a revelation is a moment of light. Right? There is the moment of revelation, there's the moment of redemption, and we tend to think of it just as a moment. But there's another whole way of looking at the problem of redemption, of impossible redemption that you can't really imagine how it's going to ever start even. And that is not as a moment, but as a process. If you think about it as a process, then what you have is a moment of light. By comparison with this moment of light, tomorrow you will have that much more light, so that you'll look back on this moment as if it were darkness. Now, that's the dialectic that he then plays with. It's a strange dialectic, because what it means ultimately is that all your moments of light will be dwarfed by what is yet to come. And it's that sense of what is yet to come, ha'atid, which isn't necessarily in your own life. Right? There's a transpersonal sense of this, that you begin to feel a real connection with what is yet to come. And so even while you're experiencing the light now of what you're actually having, you have a certain sense that it's shadowed already by the greater light that is to come. Now, it's a penumbra of some kind. Right? Something of that kind. It sounds bad to talk about the light will become dark. That sounds pretty bad. But you understand what he's saying. What he's saying is that it really all depends on those very deep processes, which are connected, to use my strange word, are connected with fantasy, with what the women know, with the work of the women in front of the mirror, in which they make real a sense of the eventual, a sense that eventually we will be beautiful. And that eventual beauty is here in this moment. Now, that's the power of that kind of anticipation. In that sense, there is no end to the process of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is exactly what the Hasidic writers want to say, that Exodus is still going on. It's a constant process because, unfortunately, there are constantly new experiences of Mitzrayim. Every age, every moment, every place has its own experience of that kind. These are particular experiences. And the only redemption, in a way, that this tradition offers to us is a kind of partnership between we who are stuck and we who have God also there with us in the middle of the stuckness. That is, moving with us, sprouting out into the world. For me, it's a kind of optimism that belongs to adults. Right? It's not an optimism necessarily for the young and hopeful. It's an optimism of those who have seen a few things, who have seen some things developing and other things not developing, Ultimately, I think it's the only real optimism, and it's an optimism that's offered in a whole tradition, in a whole Jewish tradition, starting with Kabbalah and coming to modern Hasidic thinkers who feel a need to think in terms of the organic, of something that develops unconsciously as much as consciously throughout the course of a life and throughout the course of history. Thank you.